I'd like to thank our board of directors for making all of this institution possible. So thank you to the board of directors, to our ICA team who put together these wonderful exhibitions, this panel discussion, made your entrance so wonderful tonight, and making sure that the cold doesn't get too cold tonight. I don't think they worked on that, but they're trying, keeping you warm here. Thank you especially to Jordan, our curator for the exhibitions, by David Peña and Ethan Chan. Jordan and Roxana, who handled all of the curatorial and exhibition prep. Thank you. Yes, a round of applause. Thank you. Especially to our learning and engagement team for preparing the activity for the kids, as well as to Katerina, who is our director of learning and education, for putting on this panel tonight, and to our visitor experience team, who are around and about and making sure that everything runs smoothly tonight. I'd also like to highlight too that Rebecca is over there at the membership table. So if you are not a member, your membership helps make everything that we do complimentary for everyone. We want to make sure that we provide as much access to the arts as we can. So you joining and being a member, even at a low rate of $50 a year, can help make it accessible for everyone in this county and beyond. Please join as a member tonight. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our season supporters. So the Linda Brandis Foundation, the Prebis Foundation, the city of San Diego and the city of Encinitas for helping us make all this possible, as well as the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Arts. So thank you to our season supporters. They deserve a round of applause. Thank you. And with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to Katerina. The last thing I'm going to say is on February 15th, we have an opening of another exhibition in our space in Balboa Park. So please join our email list if you're not already on it, and we hope to see you in February. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Katerina Vo. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the ICA, and we're so glad that you're all here to join us for this panel tonight. We'll get started in just a second, but I just wanted to echo Andrew's sentiments in that we would love for you to stay involved. Come back, see our exhibitions. They're always complimentary. Come back to our See You Saturday events, the next one, February 15th in Central. And then we have a whole range of classes for youth, for adults, year-round. Our next ceramics classes are starting up here next weekend. And we also have photography classes starting up both here and in the central location next weekend as well. If you have any kids running around this summer, summer camp will be starting up in both locations in the summer as well. In addition to our teen portfolio intensive, if you have any high school students that are interested in possibly pursuing the arts into the future. So there's a lot of ways to stay involved, and we love seeing you around. So definitely check it out. Talk to Anna and Amber after the panel, and we'd love to have you continue to stick around. So with no further ado, we'll get started with the panel tonight. We are joined by our artist, David Peña, one of the 2 artists in residence here exhibiting at the ICA, as well as our other amazing panelists, Mira Masukawa and Selena Jong. And I'll just tell you a bit about them before we dive right into it. So to start, David Peña is a visual artist whose work considers resilience in the face of loss and grief and explores how we carry on links to ancestral cultures even after our elders, our links to those cultures, have passed on. In his practice, he engages questions of generational healing and care through his Mexican-American identity. In the exhibition of his work at ICA, David focuses on the life of his abuelo Encarnacion, a welder for NASCO, National Ship and Steel and Shipbuilding Company in Barrio Logan, San Diego, who welded the front yard fence to their family home. A round of applause for David. Right next to David, we have Mira Masukawa, who is a licensed marriage family therapist, the founder of San Diego Grief Counseling, and the leader of California Grief Therapy Center Incorporated. Her work focuses on grief, complicated grief, trauma, anxiety, and caregiver fatigue. She is currently pursuing her doctorate in marriage and family therapy, with research focused on the role of rituals and therapy in healing grief. Mira's accomplishments include being featured on CBS San Diego News during Hispanic Heritage Month, as well as being included in Facebook's Hall of Her as one of 12 women celebrated for Women's History Month. A round of applause for Mira. And then finally, we have Selena Jong, who is a certified death doula, also known as an end-of-life guide. Death doulas are non-medical professionals who provide holistic support to individuals and their loved ones during the dying process. Death doulas offer compassionate care and guidance to individuals in their care circles as they navigate end of life and work alongside medical professionals, hospice teams, and caregivers to ensure the individual's physical, emotional, and spiritual needs are met during their end of life journey. Selena is also a hospice volunteer, sits bedside with the 11th Hour program at Sharp Grossmont Hospital, and hosts a monthly Death Cafe discussion group. So a round of applause for Selena and for all of our panelists. And we'll just dive right into the questions. All right, to start off, we'd love to hear a bit from each of you. You are all sort of approaching this topic of grief from a number of different perspectives. So why don't you all just tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and how it relates to grief? Tell us a bit about what led you to this topic and the specific ways that you're approaching it, whether it's through art, through counseling, or otherwise. We can start with you, David.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction. Check. All right, here we go. I think it might be a little loose. Okay. I'll try to hold it. So I'm an artist. When I started thinking about grief, it was in grad school. I'm sure we all experienced this quite a bit, but going through the pandemic is when I started grad school. And during that period, I was like sort of a community felt grief. Like everyone was experiencing it in different ways. And I was like far from family. It was in Oregon. And I used art as a way of processing things that were happening, like grandparents passing, a recent breakup, a friend passing away. So multitude of griefs happening at once. So using art as a way to process it was like my go-to intuition and inclination. So for me, art is obviously like the medium. And I'm thinking back to, could you say the question one more time of how
Just the work that you do and how it relates to grief. What led you to that?
Yeah. So I would say all of those things, because even like grief, if you had seen my practice before the pandemic and after, it's changed in many different directions. And I think grief has just been the main theme for quite a long time. And I'm starting to work through that process. And it's been really beautiful to have that space to, figure things out and transform it. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Mira. Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? No, need to talk a little louder. Is this better? Okay. I'm used to, talking soft in session. I came to grief because I was doing my master's and I had to get my hours for practicum. I did my hours at Hospice of the North Coast, and I stayed on for another 2 years after my hours were completed because I realized I fell in love with grief. Many people say, how can you be a grief counselor? How can you sit with that all day long? And I always say, where there is grief, there's deep love. And I love to bathe in love all day long and hear stories of how people are missing the physical presence of someone, and I help them connect to the spiritual and the emotional presence of that person. And that's when the healing is done. In my nonprofit, we have students that are able to provide grief counseling. Right now, we're working with the people in LA, and we're going to provide counseling for the victims of the fires. We did originally start by providing counseling for COVID families. So what I realized in the process of expanding my definition of grief is that we all are grieving. We all are grieving something at some point in our life. And I think that there's a beauty in that because it shapes who we are. And that's how I became a grief counselor. I fell in love with it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mira. Hi, I'm Selena. Yeah, give her a round of applause. My name is Selena. I've been with grief since I was 12. My mom died when I was 12 years old. And having come from, well, my dad came from a family of 11. We have a big family. He was one of the youngest. And so as I was growing up, all of my aunts and uncles were older and they were dying. All of my grandparents died. Several friends and even coworkers died early in my life. So I've been with grief for most of my life. And just like Mira said, I've discovered how to transform grief into love. And becoming a death doula is something that I feel is a gift that I'm giving from my grief to others, to be able to hold people in that space when they're grieving, to be able to be a container for them and to assist them to get out of their head and into their heart when people are transitioning is something that I feel that is important as a end-of-life guide to support people in this passage, in this sacred time.
Yeah, thank you all for those sort of histories that connect to grief in so many different ways. Something that really stands out to me in all of the work that you all are doing is just how many different definitions grief can have. So we're talking, of course, about end of life in part, but there's so many other ways to grieve, whether that's a tie to a specific culture, whether that is in the case of the LA fires, the sense of home, whether in the case of, COVID, for a lot of people that really fundamentally shook some ideas of what the present and what the future would look like, So what are some of the ways in, coming from all of your different perspectives and disciplines, what are some of the ways that you see grief showing up, maybe outside of this narrow, popular definition of end of life? What are some of the ways that maybe we don't immediately think of grief?
I'll answer that. I think it's several. Like, I feel like we grieve every day. We don't see it happening, but, a loss of a job, an end of a friendship, maybe something that you loved broke apart and is no longer fixable, and you're grieving the loss of just this thing. But it's grief, no less. And so being able to have the tools to be able to navigate that on a daily basis is something I feel like we're lacking as a society, and to be able to identify that as grief. And we hold it in and we don't have the tools to release. And so I think it's very important to identify these things as we're going through our daily life, that we are grieving every day and it's okay to identify it and to be able to be with it. And, do you have anything to add, Mira, on that?
I believe we're currently going through what could be called collective grief. We're feeling the pain of others, people that have lost their homes, their animals, their whole identity. And when we see it on the news, we gasp because it's a collective pain. I went to go to the scrap making place booth, and I picked up some pieces from your grandfather's ironwork, and it just brought so much joy to me because I look at grief in three parts. There's the shock, and that's what happened when we saw the fires. There's the deconstruction. That's what's going on right now while they're cleaning everything up. And then there's the reconstruction. And when I looked at your grandfather's art and your art, it's like you deconstructed his art to recreate your own. And I just felt that was beautiful.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I did not expect the visuals. I'm like feeling some kind of way right now. Yeah, totally. Especially with like if you have a chance to go upstairs and look at those fences, like I have a hard time putting words to my processes because I'm such a visual person. But I think you kind of like, yeah, you're getting to the root of it and you see it where it's like hard for me to explain it. And I think that's where I struggle, especially with talks, where it's like I express a lot visually or like, through art as a medium. And so that's going back to the question of how we experience grief daily. Like, I love the idea of like, yeah, even losing a friendship, like there's grief in that. Or I'm trying to think of like the mundane things that seem so like, that's whatever. But no, there's like micro griefs. I don't know what I'd call them, and I think that's beautiful to like identify that because there's like care in everything.
Yeah, something that I love that you said, Mira, in one of our conversations actually before this panel, was that, people have this idea of grief as in response to one, traumatic experience, but both grief and healing are this ongoing process, not, a cause and effect. It's this sort of lifelong ongoing process. And that's something that I definitely see in your work, David, with where you're sort of repurposing your grandfather's work through welding. If you all haven't had the chance to see the work yet, your grandfather was a welder, and you're sort of repurposing this work to make your own sculptures. And even in that process, you have this sort of, you're applying this heat, which can be destructive in a way, but you're also using it to create something new. And it's this softening of something that sort of hardens and can become, whether it's a fence or a sculpture or something along those lines. So this sort of duality that you see in that, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting too because my abuelo Tonito, this is his nickname, Encarnacion, he meant it for practical purposes, protecting the family, or what do you make a fence for, so that it's like stay on this side or that side, but you can also jump over it easily, and it's like sort of a signifier. But for me now to make these sculptures, right, as an artist, and like sort of look at it in a different sort of lens, and just to have that privilege and opportunity to do that, it just feels so different. And now I think I'm like, what's the practical purpose for them? And I think it's probably going to be holding plants for my mother's garden or something. I don't know, it's like it just changes. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And another sort of term that jumps out to me in your work and the way that you talk about it is this idea of generational healing. And I'd love to hear a bit more first from you, but then also from the rest of you about, what this idea of generational healing means, and how, there's this idea of linkage both, in your sculptural work and in this idea of there being, whether it's generational trauma or generational healing, how that all fits together.
I'm really curious to hear what you'll have to say about that.
I can answer that in that space. I feel like it's really important to have ritual and carry on traditions when somebody dies. It helps with healing, and especially if you can carry that on through generation and generation, it really helps remember the past. It helps us remember the past. It helps us remember our ancestors, and it really just makes us all feel like we are connected and that we haven't forgotten those that are no longer here. And so that's a really important piece that I think that we tend to forget, is the importance of ritual and traditions and carrying that on, especially when we lose somebody.
I love that. Thank you. Love the idea of rituals and how it heals our generational pain. On my desk, I've got all the pictures of my grandmothers, my aunts, my grandfathers, and I have candles by them because I believe that I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. It's sort of like healing that generational line. I'm a single mom. My grandmothers were single moms. And then I see how their stories are actually inside of me and have mirrored my stories, and I didn't even realize it. Going to the idea of rituals, that's my ritual, is paying homage to them because I feel that they're in therapy with me. But looking at the art here and thinking about the gallery, all museums, all artists, there is a healing ritual that's taking place between the artist and the medium that they're using because it's an expression. And in that expression, one could say any gathering of pieces of art is a house of ritual, such as this is a house of ritual. And when we stand in front of your work, we say, oh my gosh, how did he do that? Oh, this reminds me of, oh, did you see that, honey? And it brings an emotion out in us. This is a house of ritual. Anyway, we've got the lights to prove it.
Keep her speak. Like I feel like if I hold it in a, okay, I'm not gonna move. Yeah. I guess going back to generational healing. I mean, I see it here. Like my family's in the crowd, and I feel like there's something to knowing that that connection is important. And I think within it, like there's obviously like in all families, like there's wounds there, and I feel like working to mend relationships and generational healing is that. I think like usually requires time and space, but I think it's really important. And I think about the family because making space to do that in such a small microcosm allows you to do it in community. And I think it's like you start small and build up, especially like I've been working as a teacher, and I think about like what do I need to like heal in my life, and it just kind of like ripples out into everything else. So yeah, I think there's a lot there I could talk on, but
Thank you so much.
Also to go on the idea of ritual, you all just were gathering goods to send to LA, right? That was a ritual, was a healing ritual, right? Gathering the water, gathering the food. It was beautiful because it was an act of healing for someone else and ourselves. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, there's a ritual.
I love that sort of description of that process, and in combination with what you were saying, David, about starting at the small level, starting at the family level, and then the classroom level, and sort of rippling out. What are ways that you all see for us to be, or what are the rituals that are already existing, these healing rituals in contemporary U.S. culture? And where are there opportunities to be incorporating further this idea of ritual, this idea of a healing ritual in particular?
In the work that I do, I see, a lot of celebration. It is sad when somebody dies, but I also see that there's a shift happening to more celebration and singing and dancing and really more movement, because we store a lot of our emotions in our body and it gets stuck there. So it's so important to be able to move and get all of that stuff out. And so movement is so important when it comes to grieving and loss. And so that is so important in that ritual space, to be able to get out and dance. And you see that in different cultures, right? When they have their funeral processions in different cultures, there's a lot of singing and dancing and movement, and that's all part of the somatic experience of grief and loss. And I lost my train. What the question was?
About rituals that exist and spaces for opportunity for incorporating healing rituals.
Yes. And so in death work, it's so important to make sure we make space for that and not just have yes, we grieve and we're sad, but it's also a celebration because we are graduating. When we die, we graduate to something beyond this. And so it's so important to be able to have this ritual to celebrate us transitioning, just like we celebrate birth. Death is similar, just on the other end. And so it is really special to be able to you create your own ritual. This is a place also where we can get really creative and create a ritual for who that person was, and make it really special and unique for their specific individual personality.
One of my favorite rituals, and I used to do this at hospice bedside, is storytelling. I love storytelling, and I guess, I grew up with my grandmother telling me stories about, when she was young, and who would have thought, that would be, I would have made a career out of that. But I love storytelling, and I think there's great healing in asking, what happened when you were younger? How did you meet? Was it love at first sight? Who was your, first grade teacher? There's healing in that. And I think that the person that's passing also wants to express those stories because they're memories, they're nuggets. Anyway, I think storytelling is a great ritual. And I think that we could incorporate, which we do, a new ritual, which would be listening. And I think that when somebody is hurting, one of the greatest things that we can do is offer them a space to process, space to take their time, space to cry, space to feel lousy. And in that space, in that ritual space, knowing that it's safe, it allows them to move through it. Because we don't want to run away from grief. We want to move through grief. So storytelling, holding space, listening.
I want to add another one to that, if that's okay, because it just popped in my head when you said listening. For me, I think a ritual is doing nothing. When somebody dies, that's a chance to do nothing. Death is not an emergency. It's a time to be quiet and to be present and to just slow down. So doing nothing is also a ritual.
I always say that the last gift that someone leaves us when they pass is the gift to examine our own life. And that's in that nothingness. Because there's no other time in life where you can step back and say, wow, what's this all about? So I think that's the last gift to, to work on that idea of doing nothing, sitting in the nothingness and doing a self-examination. What do I want out of my years?
I'm gonna write this list down later so I don't forget. Thinking about this, and I was talking about this earlier. I really love the idea of doing nothing, holding space, listening, so important, and celebration. But also prayer, right? Like I grew up in a family that prays a lot, and having space, like to me, prayer is like setting intentions, and I think that's like a nice one that I often forget about, but the one I remember is like, oh yeah, this is a great space to hold for myself. And one last thing I think for ritual, and probably my favorite, is eating together. I think that's like the best ritual. Coming together as a family or with friends and cooking together. I think those are like some of the best rituals where you're like, I think that's all built in. It's like celebration, allowing space to be quiet because you have to like eat. It's like it covers all that ground. So.
So many things that I'm excited to unpack here, and so many great topics in terms of movement, storytelling, eating together, which sort of brings up for me, at least as a first thought, this idea of sort of art and the creative practice. How do you all see that playing a role in grief and in this healing process? Yes. Art and creative practices, how do you see those as playing a role in grief and in the healing process?
I'll take that. At hospice, we used to make masks, and the person would paint on the inside of the mask how they're feeling, and on the outside of the mask how they think that the world looks at them. And they're two completely different paintings. And I think that art, any medium, helps us release those feelings that we're holding in that we don't want actually to verbalize. It's a way of communication. Yeah.
In the work that I do, I try to advocate for eco-friendly practices after somebody dies. So having something that's biodegradable when somebody gets buried is important to what I do. And a lot of the times you can invite the children in and people to come in and decorate the coffin, the casket. And like Mira said, it's a great way to express what you can't specifically say at that moment, because words just don't mean anything at that moment, or it's just there's no words for what you're going through. And so it's so important to be able to have a source of expression, whether it's song and dance or art. And so that is one way in my line of work where we can express that.
I'm thinking about, like, it's funny because this work, I'm like, how does it bring people together? I guess this is an event where people are together, but I also organized like zine festival for many years, and just thinking about like how just making together is like one of the best ways that art can bring, like, literally bring people together and coming together for common reasons. So whether it's like having a project that like where you're supposed to share cultural stories together or make zines together, or I think art can bring community together in so many ways, and you can be so creative with how you approach it. So hopefully we'll talk about programming at some point. Yeah.
I also think that, just to add another thing, art is love. And when you're able to pour your love into the art that you're doing, that's another way of expressing yourself without words. That is just so unique to you that it just transcends anything that's of this world, in my opinion.
Hey, thank you all so much. And just to shift gears for a second, because we've been talking about all of these wonderful ways of sort of moving through, to use your words, moving through grief. But, you know, there's a gap, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, you know, talking about grief as a topic. A lot of times we're met with this sort of social stigma or avoidance around the topic of grief, or around, you know, death specifically. So I'd love to hear just a bit from your perspectives of how that impacts how we're experiencing things like grief, and how that impacts the healing process in that context.
I guess it's me. Yeah, we have such a stigma about talking about death and dying, that it really is such an important topic to talk about, because it's something that we're all going to go through. And the conversation of grief, and it's all connected. So it's just really important to be able to talk about it with your family and your friends, and create an open dialogue of, what do you want? What are your plans? And to not wait till the last moment, and to be able to, I guess, gift your friends and family with knowing what your wishes are. And so, you know, they're hard conversations, but it's necessary. And, you know, there are tools, there are games that you can play. They have these decks out now, like it's a card game that you can play at night with your friends, and they have these little questions, but they really just help to stoke conversation about what your end of life wishes are. And it's so important to be able to have these conversations now. We live in a society that really puts so much importance on youth and beauty, and we kind of forget our elders. And it's so important to be able to honor them, and to really not shy away from the aging process and getting older. And, you know, it's such an important conversation that I feel is left out. So that's why we need to continue to have these types of conversations and discussions. And it's so important. So, yeah.
I think there's such a stigma because we also don't really ponder the topic. And if we pondered it, we might come up to the question of, well, what happens to us after we die? And I think that in examining that question, what it means to you, what happens to you after you die, helps you when there is a loss. Recently, I had a mother, she lost her daughter, devastated. Her daughter died of cancer. She was very sick for 3 years, and the mother, she's an adult daughter, but the mother took care of her 24 hours. She had her at home. She cleaned her. She changed her. She fed her. And she said, I just miss her. I just miss her presence. And I said, well, where do you think she is? She says, I don't know where she is, and that's the problem. I can't connect with her. So I had her put her hand on her heart and talk to her inside of her heart. I said, she's right there. She was a part of you before she was born, and she's right there right now. What would she say to you? And she said all these things that she was saying to her. And I said, you found her. Do you feel it? And she said, yes, I feel it. And so we connected what she thought happened to her daughter with the spiritual presence of her daughter inside of her. And it was very healing. And then that was that. I said, what do you want to talk about now? And she said, no, I'm good. I found my daughter. Okay. So anyway, I invite you, if anyone here is missing a loved one, to ask yourself, what do you think happens after we die? And is there a way to connect with that energy?
Yeah, I wish I would have talked to you all before. That's beautiful. I don't even know what to say after that. But I do believe that you know, like my ancestors, my grandparents are living through me, and I've come to realize that through the making process, and it's just been like so beautiful to tap into that for myself.
Thank you. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions or comments, and we'll get to that in just one second. But yeah, thank you for all of those insights. And just to bring it back to your work for a second, I absolutely see that sort of either your grandfather or your ancestors in general living through you, not just in the creation of that work, but in that process, in the process of creating it. And before I do open it up to questions in just one second, I just wanted to ask one more question, which is about if any of you have experienced either, you know, a meaningful experience or project where you've seen grief transform into this opportunity for connection, for insight, or otherwise.
I went and saw a documentary not too long ago. It's called The Gift of Grief. And it was inspired by a man who lost his brother to an overdose. And he was grieving, and it was just the hardest experience for him. And he used his grief and transformed it into this beautiful documentary to be able to send the message out to people that grief is a gift. And that you can transform your grief into this love to then be able to go out into your community and share that love with others. And so that was one example that I saw of somebody really utilizing his pain to create something really beautiful for the community.
At hospice, we had a older gentleman, who was like 90, and his his job was to open the door so that the nurses wouldn't have to open the door while they were tending to hospice patients. I asked him, how did you decide to volunteer? And he said, I lost my wife, and my doctor said I needed to volunteer. I needed to help someone. I said, oh, that's beautiful. So he volunteered every day of his life. He's passed since, opening the door, greeting families so that he could heal his own grief. And it was such a beautiful idea. And I've seen it happen time and time again. When you're grieving and you give to someone else, it not only helps their grief, but it helps your grief. There's something very healing in the giving also. And it was just such a beautiful story how he became this volunteer, and it just always stuck with me.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I think just this work that I've been making recently feels like opening up a lot of conversations around grief that have been really beautiful too. And I think just listening to people's stories, like, oh yeah, I made these sculptures because I didn't know what to do with myself. And it's like, this is how I process my grief. And I feel like it just opens up some really beautiful conversations. And for me, like this recent body of work has been just like a portal into that. So we'll see where it leads. Yeah.
I'm really hearing over and over again this idea of, like you said earlier, Mira, where there's grief, there's love. But that also in this healing process, that's a generating force for, more love, more connection. So it's just beautiful to hear it from, 3 different perspectives right here. And I'm excited to hear the other conversations that come out of that. With that, I would love to open it up right now to some questions. So I'll be coming around here with this mic as the holder of the wireless mic. Just raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question or making a comment for any of the panelists here, and I'll bring the mic right on over to you.
I think in popular culture and just generally socially, we've heard a lot of portrayal of anger in the grieving process of the survivors, but I haven't seen it in myself personally in this space of the people that are dying. But recently I saw it in someone who I loved who was dying, a lot of anger, and it surprised me. I because I didn't have a lot of experience with people dying. And I just wondered what your experience was with that and what you thought artistically, therapeutically, people could do to help someone who's dying, who is experiencing great amounts of anger, to be able to move through it.
Well, we could go back to the idea of storytelling. There's a reason that anger is there. There's something at the root of it. What does that person want to say? Are they upset because they didn't get to say, I'm sorry? Are they upset because they didn't get to say thank you? There was a gentleman who was passing, and I could see he had so much anger, angst in his eyes. And he couldn't talk, so I didn't know what it was about. But I just told him, I hear you, because I could feel him. I hear what you're saying, and it's okay. And then his eyes went gentle. The thing is, we all just want to be heard. And sometimes we're afraid to be heard. We're afraid to say what we need to say while we're alive. And then I think it gets to the point at the last minutes when maybe there's even an angriness at ourselves. So I would just say, if you were bedside with someone who was feeling angry, to just hold space for them, and if they're able to talk, let them release whatever they need to release. Did that answer your question?
Hi. As an artist, I see the process of making art as a process of healing as well, because you're entering kind of a space that is like a meditation where you get often the feelings about your grief or answers as well, often while you're doing the artwork. It's really like a bubble that surrounds you while you're doing it. It's a process where for me, it's really like meditation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. It feels like a meditative process. I 100% agree with that. Like it definitely enter a different space, and it's I don't know if there's healing in it for sure. I think for me, I've been working with ceramics and different processes, but I think the repetition feels good, and it kind of takes you out of like that. Maybe if it's anger or if it's sadness or like all of those feelings that come up. But yeah, it's just like a place to put it, and I think it gets kind of like embedded in the work as well. You leave these like products. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, especially I felt that with the welding. I was like, there's moments where I was like bending metal. I'm like, oh, my grandfather did this, and it was like kind of surreal.
Thank you so much for all of your sharing. Like grief, this question might be a little bit messy. But one of the things that I feel in thinking about grief and reflecting on grief has been time. And I'm wondering what takeaways about that. I'll share maybe some of the examples I have and maybe what's missing in there. What are the other important things? I love that you've brought up storytelling, the idea of stillness. But, I've heard of like the 5 stages of grief, and it's like, oh, is it a checklist? No, absolutely not. It's a cycle. There's a sense of like doing the memory work. And then I also think about in like looking back, as well as I'm thinking about anticipatory grief of looking forward. And this grief has so many weird things with time. And I don't know if there's other things that you wanted to bring up. Again, I realize that's a bit messy question, but I love that I have an artist, a death doula, and a counselor here who just that's incredible to me. So if you have a response to that, I appreciate it. Or any other things that really just feel like an important lesson or ideas from grief.
As a grief counselor, people ask me, how long is this going to take? It's the first question. So the grief is going to be with you. I lost my grandmother when I was in my 20s. I think about her and I talk to her every day. I miss her physical presence, but I feel her with me. The grief is there with you your whole entire life. It just changes form. It changes shape. It's not so prickly. It's a little bit smoother. You grow with grief. You change. Your outlook on life changes. Your outlook on life changes, and you are an artist working with your feelings of grief. So it changes over time. It's not that the grief will ever go away. It just softens, and it becomes a part of you. But there really isn't a time frame for grief. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And that is unfortunately all the time we have for questions tonight. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us. We invite you to stick around for the next hour or so. There will be music, get a bite to eat, get a drink, and feel free to come back and visit us whenever you have a moment. So thank you all.